welcome to another episode of The Misfits.
Starring Liza
And Emma.
Yee!
Hey everyone, we are in a special place for this episode.
You know, the more observant of you will realise that we're not in our little studio this week. And it is a special place because this is where Liza found me many, many years ago. We're in Pacific Grove, California at the Jameson Classic Motorcycle Museum.
Exactly, and we're not alone. Big shout out to our crew. We got Naked Jim. Woo-hoo! And we got Tad.
Oh yeah.
Tad's doing the close-up, Naked Jim's doing the long shots, and we're sitting in a 1965 BMW R60 with a period sidecar on the side. We're surrounded by classic bikes. It's like a candy store in here.
And normally we ask people to email us with their questions. But you know what? I'm going to take a liberty here because this time I'm the one with the question.
And I'm the one with the answer.
You have all the answers. I don't know how you do it. But this time I thought, you know, what an opportunity. We're here during COVID. Museums are closed. All these beautiful bikes are sitting here with no one to admire them.
Right.
So let's come down to the Jameson and we can use examples here to help you answer the question.
Exactly. And it's going to give everybody an opportunity to see these bikes. You know, the museum's not going to be open again for the foreseeable future. And if you're watching this in another country, you may never have an opportunity to see these actual bikes. So it's a treat for me to be back here. It's very nostalgic being back in the museum. And I'm thrilled to be able to show you all the bikes that we have on display here.
So, do you want to know what the question is?
I would love to know what the question is.
Okay, so I know that many bikes are chain drive.
Yes.
Many bikes are belt drive.
Yes.
Drive shaft. There's different types of drive. I personally have bikes that are shaft and chain. But I've been told that a shaft drive bike has 30% or more less efficiency than a chain drive.
Well, that's painting in very, very broad strokes. There's a lot more to it than that because it's not just power loss, there's characteristics that it's going to give the bike. So it's an ideal opportunity for me to get out of this sidecar if I can. We're going to have a look at a few bikes. We're going to have a look at the different methods of transmitting drive to the rear wheel or within the primary drive of the bike, between the engine and the clutch, and talk about what each of them do and talk about the advantages and the disadvantages of each.
Let's go do it.
All right.
So here's what I don't understand. It seems to me that on a drive shaft where everything is rigid,
right,
unlike a chain where everything is flexible, you have things, you have the rollers wearing, you have the sprocket wearing.
Okay.
You would think something that's rigid would be more efficient.
Well, let's start with this bike. Now, this is one of my favorite bikes in the whole museum. What we have here is a 1950, that's 1950, so it's 70 years old this year. It's a BMW R25. And this is an unusual bike for a number of reasons. It's unusual that it's in this condition after 70 years. But it's unusual to find such a small capacity bike with a shaft. And we're going to get into that. So to give you an idea of what you're looking at, you'll notice on this bike, the engine is not running across the bike, which is normal on pretty much chain and belt drive bikes. The engine runs front to back. So to explain it further, on say a Triumph or an Norton, the crankshaft would be rotating like that. And then through a system of gears, it'd go back to the back wheel via the chain. On this, the crankshaft is rotating like that. And so that makes it a lot better to actually take the power off for a shaft. But the problem, everything goes through gears. And anytime you have two gears meshing together, this includes within the transmission itself, you have a marginal power loss. And so on a shaft drive bike, it's simply a case of adding up the power losses. So a lot of small power losses equal quite a substantial power loss when you take them all into account. So let's figure out what's happening. The crankshaft is rotating this way. Through the gears, it goes to the final output gear, which is inside here. It goes through this, which is actually a flexible joint. Now, on some more sophisticated machines, this would be a properly bearinged universal joint. On this, it's just really a rubber donut, because that's all it needs to be. It's just got very limited rear suspension. Now, if I turn the rear wheel of the bike, you can actually see it turning. This is an exposed drive shaft. Probably wouldn't pass health and safety these days, but back in 1950 that was just fine. So this is waiting to chew up the inside of your boot.
Okay, hold on. This looks kind of sketchy.
Yeah, it is.
Grab your boot thing.
Well, I mean, look, it's moving quite quickly, and it's very, very close to the footrest. But remember, back in 1950, no bell-bottom jeans. They were 20 years in the future. But if you rode a bike like this, you were expected to wear proper gear, which included very substantial boots. You know, you wouldn't be riding it in sandals and scraping your skin against this. So, yeah, for 1950 standards, believe me, it's just fine. So from this, which is the universal joint, the flexible joint, the power is transmitted through this shaft, and as you can see, it's turning, well, I guess whichever way you look at it. If you look at it from this direction, it's turning clockwise. And then it goes into this mechanism. Now, somebody might describe that incorrectly as a differential, because like a car, it has a means of transferring power from the drive shaft through the axle and rotating the wheel. The difference is a car has two rear wheels, and not only is it transferring power from the drive shaft into the axle, it's actually proportioning. So when you go round a corner, the inside wheel turns slower than the outside wheel. That's physics, darling. That's the differential. Now, of course, a motorcycle only has one rear wheel, so it's not a differential. It's really, you could describe it as a bevel box, a final drive gear case. Anything's just fine, but what you would find within there, you have a smaller gear in here, which has a bevel cut on it. And what a bevel cut is going to be able to do is, you've got a smaller gear coming in, and then a larger gear which is driving the wheel. It's transferring the power through 90 degrees. Right.
Yeah.
And so let's go back to your original question. You're losing power through that. You're losing power via the teeth meshing on one another. Mm-hmm. And you're losing power because the kind of oil that you have to use within a case like this, or indeed within a transmission like this with straight cut gears, is a thick transmission oil. And there's power loss through that as well.
So basically friction.
Basically, yeah.
Okay, that makes more sense.
So if we add it up, I mean, this bike has got a whopping 10 horsepower. This is not a fast motorcycle by any stretch of the imagination. So let's add up the losses.
Okay.
So we start at the crankshaft with 10 horsepower. By the time we go through the transmission to the output shaft, we've lost probably a horsepower and a half. So we're down to 8.5. We're going to lose another half between the final drive gear and the output gear for the shaft. So we're down to 8. We're going to lose at least a horsepower via the 90-degree at the back.
I think I see where this is going. So if you put enough gears in, it'll go in reverse?
Perhaps. In fact, if you put enough gears in, it may be capable of time travel. But the point is thus, if you add up all these small losses, it makes for one big loss. And so on this particular bike, 10 horsepower at the crank may end up as 6 horsepower at the rear wheel.
Got it. So now that brings up the question, why do some bikes have a shaft and some bikes have chain?
We've talked about the disadvantages of having a shaft. Now let's talk about some of the advantages. It's clean. And this is a very early example with the exposed drive shaft. In later years, all this mechanism was contained within the swing arm. So there are no exposed moving parts. So it's safer. Maintenance is limited to having a look at the final drive oil once every 10,000 miles. You may never need to change it.
I think I'm overdue.
So the point is, it's virtually maintenance free. Cleanliness, simplicity, maintenance. These are your advantages. Also, if your bike is being used in a very, very dirty application, well, you think of an example of a Super Tenere, the Yamaha. It's a desert bike. Sand, abrasion, wear characteristics. So having the final drive of the bike contained safely in a shaft where the elements can't get at it makes a lot of sense in that application.
It does.
But the difference between the Super 10 and this bike, the Super 10's got a lot more power.
Plenty to spare.
Exactly.
Ah, makes sense.
So
Great.
that's the shaft. That's the advantages and disadvantages of the shaft. Let's move on to another one, the least common of the three, and that's going to be the belt.
Okay. All right, Emma, this is a beautiful bike. What are you going to show me here?
Okay, so we've moved from the BMW to another favorite of mine, and you're going to say, all these bikes are my favorites, and they are. But what we're looking at now is our 1970 Norton 750 Commando. And the reason I've chose this bike is, number one, of course, it's probably one of the most beautiful bikes we have here in the museum. But secondly, it's going to give us an example of the two other means of driving. Now, I'm going to use the primary as an example, not least because we haven't got a bike with a belt rear drive in this museum. But this is the primary drive. It's the means of driving the crank to the clutch. But it works on exactly the same principle as the final drive. And you can see on this, it's by belt. Now, this actually predates chain as a means of propulsion for the rear wheel. The earliest motorcycles had a belt rear drive. It looked very different to this. It was a smooth belt, or it may have been made up of different leaves. So
leather.
Yes, and made of leather. And traction was always a problem. Now, of course, in later years, and with accurate manufacturing, you can actually manufacture a belt with teeth in it. And you can machine, I suppose you'd call it a pulley or a sprocket, with teeth that mesh. So traction is no longer a problem. Now, this is a lot more efficient means of driving from one point to another than a shaft. There's a lot less loss of power.
A lot less friction.
A lot less friction. However, there still are disadvantages. It does require maintenance. You have to keep it clean. It does require adjustment, so you have to maintain it. Now, in a final drive application, I've actually taken off this cover. Normally this lives inside the engine where it's quite safe. But on a final drive application, these can be quite susceptible to stones and gravel. Now, if you'll remember right, many years ago, we went to Vintage Days in Ohio, where we were doing test rides on the Zeros, and a couple of them broke their rear belts.
Yes.
And it wasn't through poor design. It was from a particularly nasty stretch of gravel road, and the gravel was getting kicked up from the bikes in front, getting entangled in the belt and punching through the belt. So that's another of the disadvantages with belt final drive. They're quiet, they're cleaner than chain, and we're going to come to why they're cleaner than chain shortly. But in terms of maintenance, it's on a par, maybe a little less than a chain. So this, I would say, from an efficiency standpoint, is right in the middle. The final example is the most efficient of all. It's purely in terms of power loss. And this is why on every sport bike made, it's chain drive. Because even after all these years, there is still no more efficient means of transferring power from one point to another than a chain. And it's very easy on this bike. Let's move back, because we've got this very nice nickel plated chain, and we can actually see the chain and how it meshes with the rear sprocket. Now also, the rear sprocket on this bike is 3 times the size of the front sprocket, which will be in here. And that's quite common. Again, to maximize efficiency of the engine, you need things spinning quite quickly in here, but too fast to spin the rear wheel. So you need to bring that gearing down. If the engine is spinning at 6,000 RPM, you really want the rear wheel to be spinning probably at a fraction of that. Probably 1,500, 2,000 RPM. So the gearing brings it down. Now, in terms of frictional standpoint, a properly adjusted and lubed chain is unbeatable. There's a 10% power loss from the engine to the rear wheel on a chain drive bike. Now, you compare that to 30% for your shaft.
Wow, well, thank you very much for explaining that.
Yeah, but let's talk about the disadvantages. A chain requires adjustment, it requires cleaning regularly, and it requires lubrication.
And there's wear.
There's consistent wear. Chains ain't cheap.
Right.
A chain will last pretty much as long as you want to take care of it, but even the best kept chain really has a life. And if you're putting 100 plus horsepower through a chain, even if you look after it like it's a newborn baby, you're still not going to get much more than 30,000 miles out of it. That's considered a very, very good life for a chain. And a new chain may cost you upwards of a couple of $100 for a good quality one. So that's one of the disadvantages.
And always change your sprockets at the same time.
Generally, it's a good plan. Because the sprockets, as the chain wears on the sprocket, the shape of the sprocket itself will change, and they become a little bit cupped and a little bit hooked. And if you put a new chain on an old sprocket, you're going to wear out that chain pretty quickly. So that's it. Chain, belt, shaft.
Are there any others?
Well, you can consider, if you want, a scooter, which really has direct drive, via the clutch, of course.
There you go.
Which you could argue is the most efficient of all. But the problem is with a scooter, if you have direct drive to the rear wheel, that's really dictating where the engine's going to be. And if you have a full-size motorcycle with the engine right there, that's not necessarily where you want it. Me, I'll take the chain every time. I know it requires work, I know it requires looking after, and it can be dirty, but if you want to get power to the back wheel, can't beat it.
Well, there you go. Thank you very much for answering that question.
Another one in the bag.
Another one in the bag. And if you would like to have your question answered about all things motorcycle
and non-motorcycle,
you can send it to Ask the Misfits. That's MISSFITS at gmail.com, and we will do our best to answer your question.
Like and subscribe.
Yes, and big thanks to our crew, Jim and Tad.
Go blimey!
Yes, and the biggest thanks of all to Neil Jameson. You know, Neil hasn't been very well lately. I know he's getting better every day. He's counting the days till he can be back in his beloved museum. And I am so happy to be back here. And it's so nostalgic being back here for me. So thanks, Neil. I really appreciate you letting us film in here.
And don't forget to check out the Motorcycles and Misfits podcast for even more motorcycle content.
We're motorcycle silly.
All right, let's get out of here.